Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Marla DeFrucio. I'm the Director of Operations for Level Up EQ and also run the operational side for these events and webinars. So you'll see me doing some tech stuff on the background. And let's officially welcome everybody and jump right on into our panel on the science of leadership. We've actually already launched a poll. This is going to have questions that will also be leading our discussion today. And I'm going to kick us off by introducing our moderator, Marla Skibbins. Marla is the fearless leader of Level Up EQ, a master certified executive coach, and a senior faculty member at the Coaches Training Institute. She's been training, coaching, and facilitating for over 2 decades all over the world with a focus in Silicon Valley. She serves executive teams in tech and biotech. And when she's not rallying our war cry all throughout Level Up EQ, you can find her taking a walk in the woods with her beloveds, rock climbing, and just being an awesome, all-around, amazing human being. So Marla, take it away.
Thank you for that intro. That's new. I love it. Thank you. And I want to thank you, Marley, really both you and Nicole. We could not do these events without both of you. And I know I say this each time, events have 2 components, love and logistics. And you both bring those. Nicole, I so appreciate your focus and love of all things Level Up EQ. And Marley, you are the wind under the wings of this. So thank you both for your attention and focus. So to you all out there, I just want to say, Level Up EQ came into being because I knew, and our team knows, that great leadership comes down to emotional intelligence, whether it's psychologically safe teams, innovation, everything comes down to really a leader knowing how to be with people. So I can't tell you how excited I am to have the panelists we have today. And we want this to be an organic conversation. And Marley and I were discussing this in the green room. Please do questions, chat Marley. This is your panel to ask questions of, and the more you ask questions, the more fun it is for everybody. So please also answer the poll, which is open and ready for you to answer. We will close the poll shortly, so please do the poll. And I'm, again, like I said, I'm both scared and excited because I think we have some amazing folks that are going to be here talking about their research and their thoughts on emotional intelligence and social intelligence. So Richard and David, I'd like you to introduce yourselves. David, let's start with you.
Great. My name is David Skibbins, and I am one of the beloveds that Marla walks on the trails with, along with our Portuguese water dog. It's tough to tell which is which, and the most beloved. I have a Ph.D. in clinical psychology with a minor in organizational development, and I've been a professor in universities teaching both of those subjects for decades. I have been a clinician for decades. I've been an executive coach for decades. I've been around for a while. I've written several books on organizational development, leadership, and coaching. I am senior faculty member at Coaches Training Institute and the head of training at Level Up EQ. And I am incredibly honored to be on the same screen with our fellow co-presenters. So I'll turn it over to you, Richard.
Hi, Marla and David. I did my first piece of research on coaching in 1967. It was published in 1970 and led to a stream of things that Dave Kolb and I were doing at the time. I did my first piece of research on competencies, which we later called EI, in 1970. I think I have the record of doing the first competency study against actual performance and of supervisory chaplains in the US Navy. And my company, McBurr, then is often cited with Dave McCullen and myself as being part of the people who created the whole competency movement in HR. Later on, in the 90s, people started calling those same things, emotional and social intelligence. But let's face it, what we're talking about is behavioral patterns. I ran research companies, both one in market research, one on HR research, psychological research for 15 years. And then in '87 became a professor at Case. And since then have focused all of my research on what I was studying all along, which is how do people change in sustainable ways? I mean, as also, David, I was a therapist in the '70s working with alcoholics and drug addicts. And, you know, one of the things that becomes very clear when you do psychotherapy on specific maladies is, on the whole, we're not all that effective. You know, and the kind of thing that, you know, our older colleague, now deceased, showed in 1968, that people in the National Health Service who got 1 year of psychotherapy and those people who were on the waiting list to get psychotherapy improved the same amount. So, and I remember in the '70s doing a lot of work, then funded by the feds, on the competencies as well as the techniques that would help people treating people with alcohol and substance abuse problems. And I remember Chad Emmerich did this masterful study in which he checked, did it matter what approach you had? Did it matter what theory you had? Did it matter if it was long and short? All these different kinds of things with alcoholics. And it turned out that nothing mattered in terms of people staying sober except what he called the skills, which today I would call the competencies of the therapist. So it kind of brings us full circle. I started relabeling what I was doing as emotional and social intelligence in '95 when Dan Goleman kind of called me and said, hey, we got to work on this together. Dan and I were doctoral students together at Harvard. So, and we were very close personal friends at the time, stayed in touch, helped each other, but then it really ratcheted up with the increased attention. So what's happened in the last 30 years in terms of my focus on intentional change and coaching, even with the neuroimaging studies I've been doing, because I've been doing a lot of hormonal and neuroscience studies around this, we now have a pretty good sense of what kinds of things really help people and what kinds don't.
Okay, I want to jump in because I want to actually ask questions so people may not even know
okay.
what.
Sorry, Marla. You asked me to talk and I could go for 8 hours.
No doubt about it.
No, and we want you to.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure.
Okay.
So dance with me. I mean it by no disrespect, but I really want our panel to know the definition. So both of you to speak to this. What is emotional intelligence exactly? Like, what the heck is that? People bat it around, but I don't think they really know what that means.
Well, what I love about Richard's work is that he, in order to define that, or in order to help to clarify the definition of that, he took it out of the whole realm of, some natural personal ability that you have in your personality that allows you to be able to be effective as a manager or a leader, and brought it into the whole behavioral realm. So that made it accessible for coaches to be able to work with rather than just psychologists to be able to work with.
Thank you, David. And I think it also provides a basis of hope. Look, the definition of emotional intelligence in the broadest sense is the ability that a person has to manage their emotions. And then if you separate within emotional intelligence, the social intelligence, which a lot of people don't, but if you do, then I would say it's the same definition, managing the emotions of yourself and others to enhance your relationships. Now, the difference, as David, you're raising, my work since 1970 has focused on the behavioral aspect. So while it is legitimate, and I now have, in my '82 book, I postulated the multi-level theory of competencies, but I've reiterated it now in a whole series of articles, some that I've written, some with Carrie Chernus, some with Dan. But fundamentally, I think emotional intelligence exists at 3 different levels within any human being. One level are the unconscious traits. Traits, by definition, are performance abilities that you use regardless of the stimulus. So optimism would be a trait linked to emotional intelligence. Self-control, would be a trait linked to emotional intelligence. And a lot of people confuse the theoretical definitions and the measures with the thing itself. I contend the thing itself has 3 levels. So measures like the mesquite measure the ability, which is at the trait level. Measures like Petrides and Furnham's TQI measure a trait. Even Reuven Baran's self-assessment looks at personal characteristics. My preference, as you pointed out, David, is to always look at the behavior. What does somebody else see? Look, Ed Hollander, who recently passed away, but in 1958, he showed that people's assessment of their leadership skills was on the whole delusional. And we've known over and over again that self-assessment is horrible. I mean, Scott Taylor at Babson has shown in multiple studies in Leadership Quarterly, Leanne Atwater and others, that professional women are horribly underestimators in terms of their own behavioral characteristics, competencies, and professional men are overestimators, which is not a surprise to professional women. But
well, and we find that again, we find that whenever we actually are working directly with people, because we use 360s as part of our intake process, and it's always very amusing to see the difference between the way they see themselves and the way they're seen within their working environment.
The other difference is that, as you said, the very beginning, my work on competencies, driven by and inspired by my thesis advisor, Dave McClellan, said, we want to start inductively. Let's start with effective performance. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get a good comprehensive measure of performance. And it varies. I mean, when you're in managerial ranks, it's almost never an output measure like sales or waste reduction, or you have to use parametric estimates like nominations, but from different levels. But the idea is if you differentiate performance, it starts to raise an interesting thing. So here we have, look, I'm on the board of the Thought Leadership Institute at ICF. A lot of my friends are ICF people. I respect the organization. And I've done work with Webex and I am BCC certified and all this kind of stuff. But all of those certification approaches are based on competency models that have no data, 0 validation, 0. So we are training in every organization people to be better coaches. And in some associations, we are certifying them on the basis of opinion. In my 1982 book,
I want to intrude because we have a question that we've really got to ask. So the research, if you were going to point us to research that actually validates what are the behaviors that you'll see that are the ones that people can develop and need to develop?
Well, those are 2 different questions, Marla. One is, can you point to the research that shows which are the competencies that validate against performance? In other words, they actually predict performance. And the answer is yes. And, you know, if you and your readers want, I mean, I have a review of a lot of that I've done for emotional intelligence competencies that came out in Frontiers in 2018. And that's open access. So
great, we'd love
we'll send that out to our participants.
And we'll share.
Yeah.
Good. I mean, I'm not the only person who does it, but this is one way to do it. And really, it talks, David, about the use of 360s as well as critical incidents, audio taped, and simulations. The second question you posed, the second part of your question, Marla, was those competencies that can be developed. To a large extent, we should keep those 2 questions separate, because it might be possible that you might discover something that is a performance ability that is not developable. If we were studying basketball players, height would be a performance ability that, you know, unless you catch the person at 10 and do some leg grafts and hormone treatments, which they did for Lionel Messi, which was why he became such a soccer superstar. But almost everything else, when we study it, if we study it from a behavioral perspective, as David, you said at the beginning, it lends itself to then people being able to say, well, can you increase that behavior? And what we now can say, because we have a number of studies, I mean, in my program at Weatherhead, we've done 39 published cohort studies showing that 25 to 65-year-olds can develop emotional and social intelligence competencies. And in some of the studies, and it holds out at about 50% improvement It's 5 to 7 years later.
So Richard,
Yeah.
I have a question for you, because it kind of goes back to one of the things you said earlier about the study when they were studying what actually works with substance abuse treatment. And one of the discoveries actually comes cycling around to your latest book, which is the importance of compassion and receptivity in the therapist in that case, and then later on you say in the coach, to create a trusting relationship. To what degree is that quality of compassion and receptivity trainable?
Well, let's break up what we're calling compassion as really, we're using the term in a Confucian sense. So we're talking about being benevolently open to caring, but you can break it up into several components. One is empathy. Do you know what's going on in the other person? And the other is, do you care? And then the other is, do you take action on it? Do you do something about it? All of three of those are eminently developable. Empathy, we know now that there are parts of empathy. Jean Dessetti, a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, has done the most careful research on this. There are certain neural networks that Tony Jack at Case calls the analytic network that you could use to use empathy to understand the other person in a more analytic way. What's motivating them? Where are their trigger points? Then you have the other side of empathy, or I call the two faces of empathy in our last book, which is the feeling with. Do you feel a part of, do you feel with? The latter one is what Carl Rogers championed in the 60s. And for those of us trained as clinicians, was the Bible. That was Rogers' work, accurate empathy, positive regard, and genuineness.
Right.
So compassion.
It underlines why we feel like coaching is so essential in creating change within organizations is that the work environment in and of itself doesn't contain those elements usually. And so to bring in someone who is an expert at that creates a safe and courageous place for the individual to be able to make a transformational change.
Well, so hang on
I
a
think
second.
That's right.
Hang on a second. I want to riff on this for a minute, because in compassion, I know that there's been a big change in the last 2 years, but that's a very squishy, non-business type of thing. However, I would love for you both to speak to, well, why is that important to business? Why is empathy, caring, feeling with, taking action? What does that have to do with business and great leadership?
2 data points, Marla. One, about 15, 18 years ago, a group did a survey of 1,800 MBA graduates in Europe. MBAs, full-time MBAs have a tendency to change jobs within 3 months of graduating, and then again in another year. They studied people 2 years afterwards, and they asked them, why did you choose to go to work for the organization you're now working for, and why do you stay? They compiled all the answers, and money, comp, benefits, salary, all that stuff was number 7.
Yeah.
The top 6 things, and these are from MBA graduates. These aren't social workers. These are MBA graduates. The top 6 things were chance to do something interesting, chance for development, a sense that the organization invests in me and my growth, chance for novelty. It was all growth oriented. Flip to the other data point, pre-COVID, 76% of the people in the North America with full-time work were not engaged in their jobs.
Yeah.
83% in Europe, 81% in Japan. That's a motivation crisis.
Yeah.
That says that people don't care. Now, when you look at the actual research studies that say what predicts engagement or motivation or your desire to use your talent when you have a job, every study keeps coming back to the quality of your relationship with your immediate boss. And I mean, even Marcus Buckingham said people don't leave organizations, they leave managers.
Yeah.
Right.
And when you ask people, what are the characteristics that you value? They all can be coded under what we call emotional and social intelligence. Does the person trust me? Do they value me? Do they respect me? Do they ask me questions? Do they listen to me?
Yeah.
There are all these things. Nobody says, and I do this exercise of bosses who brought out the best in you, leaders versus ones who didn't. I do it an average of 60 times a year, and I have been since I started using that exercise in 1999. And nobody has ever said, well, they give me really hard and fast, clear goals.
Yeah.
And I've done this in like 45 countries around the world.
Right, I
So,
know.
So
the idea,
you're not saying compassion, but you're saying somebody who
I'm
cares
saying
about
caring.
you. Yeah,
I'm
somebody who
saying caring.
cares,
If
but it's the same thing.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
If compassion feels too fuzzy, and too much like rainbows and unicorns, then
Not
just
to
say
me.
caring.
Right.
Right, but we
An
have to-
empathetic environment.
Wait, hang on. I just want to say this. I want to make a moment, take a breath and go.
Jump in.
So listeners, no, there are a lot of leaders on this call listening and ones that will listen later. We are in the middle of, if we think about another epidemic, it's the resignation pandemic. And what was prior to is even more intensely needed, which is this caring and what you're both talking about, emotional intelligence in their leaders, or people are going to just continue to leave. So I'm just so grateful to hear all of the research you've done, because it's just that much more relevant now.
And I don't mean to be, I do mean to be a pitch for coaching, obviously. It's changed my life and I devoted my life to it. But I think one of the things that this research points to is that there is no way to learn those skills necessarily in a work environment unless you're in a work environment with someone who embodies those skills, who has the capacity for empathy and connection and receptivity and compassion, and who is able to be with you in a non-judgmental way. And finding non-judgmentalness in a working environment is extremely difficult.
yeah, right. Or finding in politicians.
Yeah.
So yes, now one of the things we talk about in chapter 8 of our recent book on helping people change is the fact that although we're talking about how to inculcate coaching into a whole organization, one of the aims of this all is, I believe strongly that we should aspire to having organizations that develop a culture of development to complement the culture of performance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That we don't want to eliminate the culture of performance or
Right.
results, but we want to complement it with the culture of development. Otherwise, retention and engagement will continue to be horrible.
Right.
And where does development come from? It comes from people feeling like the organization values them and invests in them. Now, a lot of that comes from the interactions with the immediate boss. I do think one-on-one coaching is absolutely brilliant. We don't have much data that says it works. We have a smattering of studies. We have more in the health area than we do actually in the business management area. But we've got, I think 3, mostly around goal attainment or one on sense of well-being. We're going to start seeing more of those. But the key that we have to think about is other forms of coaching.
Yeah.
Most organizations can't afford to pay even an internal coach to work with other than the top 300, 500 executives. What happens to the 25,000? So one of the issues that I'm really pushing right now is consideration of peer coaching in groups. Yeah. I raised it in the MOOC we did in 2015, and again in chapter 8. But we even started a study group at CASE about this, because I've got 2 doctoral students and 1 faculty member doing different studies on peer coaching in groups. Eventually, we want to get there. Now, the problem is if you don't help, to go to your point, David, if you don't help those individuals in the groups, then they just become venting sessions or, excuse the expression, bitching sessions instead of constructive helping sessions. So there still has to be some form of training.
There has to be skill training, which is, organizations are starting to talk about, and we'll talk later about something we're going to do where we're training leaders in coaching skills, which, will be what people need in those kinds of groups.
Right. They need to know how to ask open-ended questions. They need to know how to be more curious than they have than authoritarian, not
Terry
be giving
Malpia
advice.
At Columbia Teachers College based their whole year-long coach training program, which is marvelous. It's one of the best programs I know out there if you're starting from not doing any of it. He bases a lot of the work on trying to get people in management positions to add coaching to their repertoire.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions from the audience. One of them, and I have the same question. You started out, Richard, talking about the 3 levels of EI, I think, and you started out
Yes.
with the unconscious traits. And if you could just briefly outline what are the other 2 levels
Okay.
of that, it would be great.
Going up from the deeply unconscious, not deeply, unconscious is unconscious, you're not aware.
Right.
And it's psychologically, it's how you're going to respond no matter what. It's like if you walk fast, you're going to walk fast no
Right.
matter where you are.
And then number 2.
Number 2 is self-perception. And this actually has to do with what McClellan used to call self-schema. You could call it self-image. What do you think of yourself? The problem is almost every self-assessment test, rather than the 360s, captures that.
Yes.
But that may or may not be related to how a person acts.
To the
third
reality,
level,
right?
well, it depends on how you do. It's reality, but for the individual.
Yeah, for the individual, right.
But the third level is what I've been calling the behavioral level. That's what other people see. So in my intentional change theory, the second discovery is your real self. And I keep having to tell people that doesn't mean what you think of yourself. That means what other people experience you as, because that's the real
it's
self.
assessment as much as it is self-reflection. It's assessment from other people of who you
right.
are and how you
What your
operate.
impact is, what your impact is as a human
Yes.
being, and what your impact is as a leader.
Mhm.
And I think those 2, because in the self-assessment, what I think is important, I don't know if this is part of it, but I think it is from what I understand from your work, Richard, is it's not just what we think of ourselves, it's also our deep intrinsic motivators, our values, our purpose, who we want to be in the world.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, for decades, I've said to my wife, we've been happily married 45 years. We've known each other for 50 some. And we're still going really well. But I've always contended to her, I'm a really flexible guy. I'm high on, in my self-assessment, high on adaptability. And that's what she does, David. She laughs. And she says a little bit of course correction here. So when a number of my doctoral students over the years have said, I want to study adaptability or flexibility or any characteristic, I'll say, get people's roommates or their spouses or partners or somebody that they live with
Yeah.
to assess it also. Because what my wife doesn't realize is that when I'm thinking about how open I am to something that somebody just said, it might come across to somebody else as you're budging a little bit. They don't know how far I've come to budge that little bit.
Right.
I do inside. And I mean, my parents were Greek immigrants and my mother is from Crete, Southern Crete. And, Cretans, I used to say this because it was true of even my grandparents. I learned early on to set a goal that I wanted to be able to increase forgiveness, because among Cretan society, if anybody's offended you or your family, you're supposed to get back at them and their progeny for 400 years. I've gotten it now lowered to about 40 years. Grudges for about 40 years.
You have the Furies in check. That's great.
Well, I don't know if in check, but that's what I mean by self-assessment takes a different context.
Yeah.
The problem with self-assessment, and actually you brought it up in one of the things that you wrote, and I think it is a problem that may be insurmountable, which is in an actual work environment, not like in a research environment where we can have videotapes and simulations and everything else, but in an actual work environment, mostly what we have are 360s. And that's great if the material that you get from the 360s, it first of all is analyzed in somewhat of an objective way, and second of all isn't also contaminated with whatever the culture of the organization as a whole is.
Well, it can't not be.
Yeah,
it has to be somehow, which is why when I have a lot of the doctoral students I work with, because that's mostly what I teach, and if they're collecting their data, which almost always on adults, i.e. over 27, between 26 and really 75, I'll say, okay, you have to get them from multiple organizations, because organizational culture will affect what you think is acceptable.
Right, because it's a culture.
Yeah.
And that paints the color for sure.
Right.
That's great. Okay, I have a question from one of the audience members that I think would be very interesting. Given I know for us, some of the clients that we work with are the personas that end up being in coaching. So here it is. So let me read it. so here's the question for both of you, actually. Can you both talk about helping with empathy skills for folks that are atypical or on the spectrum?
Whew.
Notice how we both want to jump into that one.
Because I work at a medical school and have worked with some of the folks that run the autism center for all of Cleveland's hospitals and all that. But anyway, it's important to recognize that as soon as somebody's on the spectrum, they have a dysfunction in what Tony Jack calls the empathic network. So technically it's the default mode network, but it's the network in your brain, different parts of your brain. It's none of this right brain, left brain bullshit, which we've proved is foolish. It was pop psych in the 90s. But the empathic network enables you to be open to another person and to new ideas. The one place where people on the spectrum have the most dysfunction, in other words, of all of the major networks in the brain, the one that has the most interruptions is the empathic network.
And because I also worked with autistic people for 10 years, I would say, in answer to the person asking the question, the best approach for someone who is atypical is curiosity. Is like, tell me some more about that. I'm trying to understand what that's like for you. And to really rely on open-ended questions and actually allow your inability to not understand the other person to open up a conversation rather than to close it down.
And I would say it really depends on how far they are on the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, if they're like Rain Man,
yeah,
if they're like even Doc Martin, if you watch the TV series, or you know, the folks on Big Bang Theory, Sheldon's, you're probably not going to get to them because they are so entrenched in the analytic network that they are what most of us would call excessive nerds. Well, excessive nerds is the spectrum, but it's the spectrum in terms of that analytic part.
Right.
If somebody isn't that far into the spectrum, then very often you can reach them. People used to say, well, let's reach them through the analytic thing and get them to rationally come back. It turns out it leads to false behavior.
Right.
And you're overemphasizing the analytic. You have to have something where they can feel. I mean, one of the most powerful therapy programs that I observed in the 70s with autistic children was music therapy, where it had to do with sitting at a piano, or art therapy. So it is emotional expression through a different vehicle.
I have a question. So I'm wondering if you...
David doesn't seem like this at all.
No,
sorry.
Yeah, not on that end. No.
We use play therapy with David.
So I'm curious if you've run across any research anywhere where, and this could be with people on the spectrum or just people that are not, around developing that ability to be empathetic and what's called loving kindness meditation or metta meditation or compassion practice or meditation, and what you would say there in both spectrum. Yeah, go.
Again, you're adding too many different things into here. Let me deconstruct it a little bit, Marla. One, can you enhance empathy? Yes. Perhaps the most dramatic work I've seen in the change efforts at this comes from Helen Reese, who's a psychiatrist at MGH and the Harvard Medical School, and even decided as a sidelight to create a company called Empathetics, because she was able to develop 3 one-hour training modules for physicians and has phenomenal results in how other people report their empathy later. So, and now she's extended it to doing it with people in companies and all that. And it's not, you know, when you look at what really works, it's not all that surprising. You know, some of it is just tuning into the other person. How does the other person feel, not just think? So yes, empathy can be developed In particular, it can be developed in adults. The work from Roger Weisborg and folks at Castle at the University of Illinois at Chicago has been phenomenal at showing how social emotional learning can work with 5 to 18-year-olds. I have no idea about 18 to 26-year-olds. They've always been a kind of blind spot or a black hole for me. But at any rate, now the other part of your question was, you always have to take into account how close the person is to what I call the tipping point, which is, and I've been saying this for decades, when you want to help somebody work on a weakness, I don't think you should do it too often. I think mostly people should just work on their strengths and using them more. But in reality, sometimes we have to work on a weakness. So rule of thumb, 1, never work on more than 1 or 2 at any time. And 2, never work on a weakness in which you're not close to the tipping point for when that will tip into making you effective, whether as a family member or at work or whatever. So if people are close to the tipping point, you've got something that they're doing that is either showing the inclination, or they care about it, but they don't know the skills, or they have some skills, but they're not comfortable with them. And it's easier to help them through practice. And of course, it has to involve practice with other people. Now, there are things like, and Dan Goldman and I just published a paper on a series of studies we did on a new measure we created to help people look at the number of moments of renewal that they had, parasympathetic activation in a week versus stress. I mean, anybody who thinks you can do better by lowering your stress level is really deluding themselves, because you're still going to have annoying negative effects of stress, just milder. What we need is more of these renewal or parasympathetic moments. And what we know is that meditation is one of the maybe 18 activities that has been proven in multiple studies to work. Loving kindness meditation works, so does transcendental, so does any of the others. Honestly, I don't think there's any evidence yet to show that any one form of meditation is more powerful than the others.
Okay.
Yoga helps, Tai Chi helps, prayer helps if it's to a loving God, exercise helps if it's modest, being in a loving relationship helps, helping people less fortunate helps, helping the elderly helps. I always tell my graduate students, helping elderly professors get you closer to heaven.
Definitely. That's one of the best things you can do.
Having dogs or cats help.
Yes, dogs. Yes, I will upvote that one. So
walking in nature helps, by the way. So your walks in the woods or in the beach really does matter.
Yeah. I'm going to underline, and then I have a very long question that I'm going to read it to you both so you can answer it. But I will underline that now more than ever, I think we need those moments of renewal. And I'm seeing that as a trend coming out in my coaching plans when I work with people, that self-care is showing up even more as something that's critical for continued ability to stay in an organization. Because
or in a relationship, right?
Well, right. So I just want to say yes. Here's the question from one of our audience members. Many supervisors tend to avoid difficult conversations or uncomfortable conversations. Could the similar avoidance of psychological discomfort or psychological pain be a roadblock to empathy? And then I will continue with what this says. I may be really reaching here, but trying to get to the button of why some leaders do not empathize. If this is completely off base, then what are the primary barriers to empathy, and how do we facilitate leaders overcoming them?
Okay, I want to say something about that, which is, it reminds me of like when I have initial conversations when somebody's inquiring about whether or not they want to be my coach. I come from an attitude that people are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. That actually, I embodied that. I have to love the person before I even start talking to them. And particularly once I start talking to them, when you come with an open heart to someone, then you can have all kinds of difficult conversations with them because they know it's within the context of your trusting, resonant relationship. It's not coming from some kind of external judgment or attack of them. So the problem isn't how difficult a conversation you can have. The problem is, do you care about the other person? If you don't, no matter what kind of conversation you're going to have is going to be difficult.
So what's the roadblock?
Well,
This is what this person is asking.
Well, let me put what you're saying, David, into context. I think the person's looking at it the wrong way. That if you look for the obstacles, you'll find obstacles.
Yeah.
You know, and the fact that the mother had the person had a father who was cold and distant. I mean, what are you going to do about that? So in my theoretical work, and now we have in terms of the fMRI studies and neuroscience studies, some pretty clear image that if you want to encourage people to change, look for the positive attractor that's pulling them to it. So don't look for what's getting in the way, look for what encourages it or causes it to happen. Now, if you run up against somebody who never shows empathy, what do? You know, my easy answer is feed them more fiber. Because obviously they're just too uptight or defensive. But the reality is, as long as they're defensive, you're not going to reach them.
Yeah.
And if you try to remove the things that make them defensive, you're never going to get there because there might be stuff that happened 40 years ago. The key would be to observe people and to see when do they light up.
Yeah.
And then start there.
I love that you're saying that, because people are not going to necessarily change because you bring in a stick. But if you bring in a carrot, if you say, why does this matter to you? What would make the difference for you in this particular thing? Or does it? Because people are not going to necessarily want to change if they don't have a real why for it, or what we call that it matches up with their values or purpose.
Actually, I think if it matches up with their purpose, I'm not sure matching up with your values is enough, because we know from social psychology that values and behavior have very little correlation.
We may have two also definitions of what values are, which we don't need to go into, but
okay,
great. But purpose I can align with too. Fine.
Yeah, but the core issue is we know that treatment adherence for most maladies is abysmal. I mean, if 50% of the people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, people only do 50% of the things their physicians or nurses say to do if they're diagnosed. It's the same with orthopedic surgery. If you break an ankle or have a knee replacement, people do about half of what they should do. My cardiothoracic students tell me that the research on coronary bypass surgery says treatment adherence is about 20%. So, and why does that happen? I think it's because physicians and nurses try to scare the hell out of people.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't do this, you're going to have to take this medicine, and then we'll have to amputate your foot, and this and that. So, I mean, I think the data is pretty clear. Giving people feedback is horrible. Unless the person asked for it, but really asked for it. Not this, well, you're my boss, you know, what do you think? Which is mostly, you know, that kind of thing.
Please don't tell me. I want to hear I'm great. Yeah.
Right. So giving people feedback is just another way of being a helping bully. Telling people what they should do is another way of being a helping bully. I mean, you're a helping imperialist in those cases.
Right.
People are not going to change. They might change right away, especially if you hold life and death powers over them, but within a few weeks they atrophy. So the sustainability of any effort relies on something that positively drives them.
Yeah.
One of them is it consistent with their passion, their purpose, their vision, the person they want to be, their aspiration in that way.
Yeah.
That we find in change efforts turns out to be probably the most compelling, organizing, consistent driving force. The other is go back to David, your point, a resonant, caring relationship. Those two so far, we've got pretty strong physiological as well as psychological data.
And I'd add on trying experiments and succeeding at them.
Yeah.
And that helps on the practice side. So,
Yes.
you know, once you get some motivation or drive, then the question is, what do you really do?
Yeah.
And that's right. That's where lowering the intensity. I mean, I always say never try things in the place where it's the most needed. I mean, I had one example that I put in the 2002 and the 2005 book of a very successful 40-ish-year-old executive who was brilliant, socially charming, really good looking. People enjoyed being around him, but his subordinates consistently said he really didn't develop them. He wanted to get to learn that. We came up in the coaching session I had with him, and as actually wife came up with the idea first, that he should coach his son's soccer team. Because when he thought about his son, his 11-year-old son on the field, he loved soccer. He wanted his son and his friends to enjoy the game. He didn't care about the score.
Right.
And it was all the good stuff that you'd want as the context.
In a low stress environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
He did it for one summer. He loved it so much. He did it for another summer. In the meantime, he started trying it at work.
Yeah.
Within 4 years, he got transferred as the head of the Latin American division of this huge multinational oil and gas company. And then he then he went to work for one of the big consulting companies, global. And all of a sudden, the norm was to have 2 or 3 people that you were mentoring. He had 30.
Yeah.
Because people were coming to him.
Yeah.
So the idea is practice and do the novelty, as you said, David, but in those settings where the risks aren't that high.
Low
So
stake.
if you're having trouble with empathy, don't practice with your spouse.
Yes.
The stakes are too high.
Oh, well, oh, okay. Okay, I'm gonna grab.
Use empathy with your spouse. Don't practice.
So I have one more question because I want to be mindful of time. And the question is, would you agree that EI should be the focus of leadership development, especially to better manage diverse groups? What other skills should be leveraged, developed to lead inclusively?
You don't need anything else. No, I mean, look, you're not going to be an effective leader. I have a couple published studies, different levels of leadership, showing a really effective leader uses certain emotional intelligence competencies, certain social intelligence competencies, and certain cognitive ones. They aren't always the same ones. So it's not like I could say which one is the key, but they come from a small set. I mean, there's a set of maybe 12 to 15 EI and SI, and maybe 3 cognitive behavior patterns, traits that are key, not traits, habits. So I would say yes, to think, look, a leader's job or a manager's job, because they're really the same job, is to leverage the human capital. And you don't do that unless you excite people, and you don't excite them unless you're able to create a really engaging environment and relationship.
And I think in working with a diverse population, one of the ways to create that engagement is, first of all, know what your own role carries, whether it's the color of your skin, or whether it's your gender, or whether it's your position within a company. And then with the people that you're interacting with, be curious about who they are, what their experience is like, how their experience is different from yours, in order to create that trust, because that trust isn't created by you having answers. It's created by you being receptive to what their worldview is.
But I also think, David, we have to be very careful. I mean, the DEI avenging angels throw up if when they hear me say this, but or they come after me, which they often do. But the fact is that if you assume that a person had a different background or different appearance because their gender is different, their color is different, their gender identity is different, or any of these things are different, then you're being as much of a racist, sexist as the person who doesn't look at it at all. But your point is you have to somehow find out their context.
Yes.
And that ends up being very important.
Yeah. And then they can begin to trust you, because they don't think that you're going to be deciding ahead of time who they are or what they bring to the table.
Right. So, wow. I mean, what I'm hearing really, I mean, I'm a simplifier, and which is not always good because, you know, Richard's caught me in a couple of those, but it really feels like what the culmination of what's being said is that EI matters, period, matters to us and our greatness, whether it's in a soccer, you know, as a soccer coach or as a leader of people, it matters and is the definer. And I think the other thing that really I know, and I know our company knows, but what you're saying, Richard, as well, is that reaching into the magical motivation of human beings, their purpose, their vision, their aspirations, what they find exciting and engaging and fulfilling is the way to create change.
Right. You have to find that out. By the way, Marla, just to correct you, you didn't say anything wrong. What you were doing is adding two things at the same time.
Well, which is, yes, thank you for
No, it's okay.
correction.
No,
So I really appreciate the conversation, and it's, you know, for whatever it is, intuitively, I knew this, and I think probably all of you, both, particularly Richard and David, I imagine you had a hunch this was an important thing and started to do your own research around it. Obviously, Richard, and I know David as well. So it just makes sense on an intuitive level that human beings need to be great human beings in order for, I always go back to the savannah. We needed to be good together in order to survive, you know, as a tribe. And, you know, it isn't about how well we fight, it's about how well we are together. And, you know, I love all the studying, because right now there's such a need for, let's scientifically validate that this actually matters, because there's such a fight around, is this profitable? Well,
and I published a study in 2006 that I did at one of the big 5 consulting firms that are really accounting firms. And this one had 85,000 accountants working for them. They had 8,000 partners, showing the dollar value of operating profit in a longitudinal way. So I measured 360 on their competencies. Then I followed their accounts for 7 quarters. So I could annualize, I had the revenue and the gross margins, the operating profit. And it does. EI pays, SI pays, and cognitive intelligence pays. So they really do yield.
yeah.
But your point, Marla, which I think is so easy for people to realize if you just catch your breath, is if you ask the question, who do you want to be around? You know, who do you enjoy working with? What kind of individuals and what kind of relationships do you have with people that you're the most creative, that you help serving people the best, you help coming up with things that help the organization, but your family and society. And nobody will say, you know, the dictatorial, you know, SOB, nobody.
Yeah.
Actually, nobody will say the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
What they will say is variations of that. And it's not to say that you can have people that are cognitively challenged, but are great at emotional and social intelligence. That doesn't work either. We need a balance.
Yeah.
And when you're in a leadership or management position, like when you're in a coaching or helping position, you are more infectious. I mean, the emotional contagion happens in 8 to 40 thousandths of a millisecond, brain to brain. When you're in positions of responsibility, you're more infectious because people are turning to you for guidance.
Yeah.
They're looking for subtle cues, and they're picking up the stuff, not just on your face, but what you're feeling inside,
Yeah.
regardless of how good you think you're masking it. So part of my message is to people who are coaches, you know, the first thing you have to do is pay attention to your own renewal. You have to be excited about life. You have to feel hopeful. You have to feel caring. And that's one of the things that I think very often in tough times we let slip by, is the kind of, some people call it self-love. you know, I don't want to get carried away with it, but it does have to do with making
Renewal.
sure that you're still excited about life.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
if moods are contagious, then
They are.
you need to be the mood of the
Right.
joy towards
Right.
life.
Yeah.
Right.
And excitement and engagement,
Mhm.
because that reads, as I'm a dog trainer too, and we talk about it going down the leash. It goes
Mhm.
down the leash, it goes out, like you said, in milliseconds.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and friends of mine who lead the equine experience, whether outside of
Mhm.
Cleveland,
Mhm.
Jackie Stevenson, or folks at Miraval, it's even more extreme because horses are huge,
Right.
yeah,
but are prey. Dogs are both prey and predator,
Right.
yeah,
and depending upon the breed, you know, you have a mixture of things.
Mhm.
But it's just so amazing when you're working with. It doesn't seem to work with cats or birds or fish. They
Right.
don't seem to be as
they
responsive.
have a different.
I'm not saying they can't be as loving.
No. But
Oh no, you're
not-
going to get the cat people going. Don't do that.
No.
Don't do
And
that.
the research says having a cat is as powerful around renewal as having a dog,
Yeah.
horse, or monkey. Has to do with the stroking. It
Mhm.
doesn't work with fish because if
You
you're
can't
hard to
stroking them,
stroke.
chances are you're killing
Definitely
them.
Okay. I love it. Now we're going to go off into, this is the next webinar, the weird places we go. No. So I want to wrap by saying, again,
My name is Marla, and I'm here to say, oh, not that rap.
not that rap. I wish I could.
The one with the
I'm-
W in front of it.
I would
Got it,
need
got
to
it, got
be
it.
writing that. I can't do it in the minute, in the moment. That the takeaway for me is, I think I have three things I want to say. One, I loved your pointing to have people both not focus on a lot of difficult things they need to grow at once, and focus on one, and then focus on it in a really in a place that the stakes are low. I love that takeaway. Another takeaway I have is that it really matters that we reach into the magic of individuals
Yes.
and find what is intrinsically motivating to them, and that EI is what will create profitability. It's not the only thing, but that it matters, and it will matter even more now as we move into a new dawn of what work is. So I want to just thank you each for your contribution to the conversation and helping our both the people that are on right now and the people that will listen later. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, David. And the last parting thing I want to say for the folks listening is that don't miss the next workshop that we're going to be doing, or the next event, which will be a free event in February. And it'll be the 16th, which is empowering your employees. So that is exactly what we're talking about, which is helping our employees feel empowered through their own intrinsic motivation. And then we're going to do our first workshop, which will be happening in March. It'll be an hour-and-a-half workshop on coaching skills for leaders. That'll be March 14th. So if you're interested in that, you'll be getting an email from us that will touch on that, I believe, also giving you the recording for this amazing panel. And thank you again, both Richard and David, for your spirited and informational and obviously intrinsically motivating conversation for both of you. And I can't tell you enough, Richard, how grateful I am that you would spend time with us, sharing your wisdom and your many, many years of research. We feel deeply grateful. I was scared and a little, excited, scared, hard to tell which it is, to have you on stage. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. We're going to invite you back. Hopefully we'll have you again. Thank you so much. So
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
It's been a great honor to be here.
Yay. So thank you all, and be well, be safe, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
So long, everyone.
Bye.